Matthew 26, verse 36 is where we are picking up from last time. Matthew 26, 36. Now, this last few chapters of Matthew has a few key nuggets, but frankly, there's a lot more action. If you'll notice, I'm sure you have, there's no lengthy dialogues by Yeshua or theological questions from the disciples or arguments with the Pharisees. But, so, it could be that we can move a little quicker because we're just going through some action and there's maybe not a lot to say about it. But there are still some powerful theological nuggets here and there that we'll need to discuss. But maybe we can move along a little quicker, so we'll see. But Matthew 26, 36 through 56 says this. So then Yeshua comes with them to a place called Gat-Sheminim or Gethsemane and says to his disciples, "Sit here until I go away and pray further on." And taking with him Kepha and the two sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and deeply depressed. Then he says to them, "My spirit is very sorrowful, even unto death. Remain here and watch with me." And going forward a little, he fell upon his face, praying and saying, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me, but not as I will, but as you will." And he comes to the disciples and finds them sleeping, and says to Peter, "Thus you have not been able to watch 1 hour with me? Watch and pray, that you enter not into temptation. The spirit indeed is ready, but the flesh is weak." Again, going away a second time, he prayed, saying, "My Father, if this cannot pass from me unless I drink it, thy will be done." And coming, he found them again sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. And leaving them, he went away again and prayed the third time, saying the same thing. Then he comes to the disciples and says to them, "Sleep on now, and take your rest. Behold, the hour has drawn nigh, and the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Arise, let us go. Behold, he that delivers me up has drawn nigh." And while he was yet speaking, behold, Yehuda, one of the 12, came, and with him a great crowd with swords and sticks from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now he that delivered him up had given them a sign, saying, "Whomever I shall kiss, he it is. Seize him." And immediately coming up to Yeshua, he said, "Hail, Rabbi," and covered him with kisses. But Yeshua said to him, "Friend, for what purpose have you come?" Then coming up, they laid hands upon Yeshua and seized him. And behold, one of those with Yeshua stretched out his hand and drew his sword, and smiting the bondsman of the high priest, took off his ear. Then said Yeshua to him, "Return thy sword to its place, for all who take the sword shall perish by the sword. Or do you not think that I can call upon my Father, and he will furnish me with more than 12 legions of messengers? How then should the scriptures be fulfilled that it thus must be thus?" In that hour Yeshua said to the crowds, "Are you come out against a robber with swords and sticks to take me? I sat daily teaching in the temple, and you did not seize me. But all this has come to pass that the scriptures of the prophets may be fulfilled." Then all the disciples left him and fled. So there's that section. Now, one of the things that caught my attention here is the place where they are meeting, Gat-Sheminim. Would you know what that means?
Oil press?
The like an olive press. One of those little devices that crushes an olive in order to get the oil out of it. Do you think that might be significant to what's taking place here at the place of the crushing olives? How much?
Isaiah 53 talks about being crushed, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I don't know the word, but I think it's
Yeah, I think that there's definitely a spiritual application here. And in fact, if you look at the other Gospels, and I think it's the Gospel of John where it says that he is like sweating blood at this place here at the Garden of Gethsemane, and his spirit is definitely crushed. I mean, he is praying 3 times, and he says, "I am troubled in spirit, even unto death." And he is definitely sorrowful, and it reminds me of an olive being crushed. You know, that, I mean, what do they crush olives for?
For the oil, it's only worth something for the oil. So when you crush the olive and then you get the oil, that's where it comes in its price. That's how it becomes more expensive than olive.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, they've got, what do they use olive oil for?
Like the lamp,
All kinds of
For
stuff.
lighting the lamps of the menorah,
Healing.
Making bread.
anointing.
anointing oil, baking. Yeah, you can use it on making bread. What's that?
Flavor.
Yeah, flavoring.
That's a salad.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, do you know about the olive, the purification, the different levels of purification of the olive oil? What do you know about that?
I'm trying to remember because I was in Jerusalem, we were in the Garden of Gat-Sheminim, and it's really amazing how they are the oldest olive trees, I believe, in the world. It's pretty impressive. And then that guy told us that actually the finest oil that has been used to anoint kings was after the third pressing. And there is something Yeshua did in the garden 3 times, and I try to remember the whole thing, but there was a connection between the number, something he did 3 times, and then the third pressing is the one that the first one is kind of used for, I don't know,
Maybe
more like baking or something,
Right.
and the third is really the anointing.
Right. Yeah, that's what I have heard as well, is that the first pressing is like common,
Yeah.
and like the second pressing is like extra virgin olive oil, and then the third pressing is like really the pure stuff that is used in the anointing and the oil for the menorah and stuff like that. So it's kind of interesting, and it really, I think, paints a spiritual picture about, it's almost like that spikenard stuff that we talked about last week, where it's like you crush it and the smell comes out, and that's how it is with a lot of things, and it's especially true of olives, and it's just interesting that he's in this place called the olive press, and he is being crushed like an olive, and his spirit is pouring forth his agony regarding now that's a good question. Yeshua says he is deeply sorrowful, and even the word here is depressed. Now, I don't know if that's an accurate translation of the Greek text, but what is your thoughts regarding why he is in such agony? What precisely is causing him to be in such agony? Is it the anticipation of death? What do you think is causing him trouble? Grace?
He knows he's going to have to be totally separated and shunned by his family.
It makes you wonder, because a lot of times you can look at commentary and say, well, this proves that he was a man. This proves that he was truly human, that he had a fear of death and was terrified about what was going to happen to him. And I'm like, okay, there might be some truth to that he is human.
What was going to happen afterwards?
It's true. It's not like it was unknown what was going to happen to him. But I tend to think, if you want to attach just regular human anticipation of great suffering and death, maybe that's part of it. But I think that Grace might be onto something, in that we're looking at something a little bit more spiritual and a little bit deeper than just I'm afraid of dying and I'm afraid of what's going to happen to me. Do you think?
What about taking upon all of our sins as well?
And I think that's kind of what Grace is talking about, is the fact that when all of our sins are coming upon him, then it's like the Father has to turn away, for a moment there, and that's why he says, Father, why have you forsaken me? It's like God had to turn his face away from him. He can't have fellowship with Yeshua when he's taken upon him the sin of the world. And I think maybe Grace is right that that's a big part of it, is that he's anticipating a separation from his Father, which has never happened in eternity. That's a powerful thing right there. It also makes me wonder about the things that he sees in the future that will happen to his people. that as a result of him dying, and a result of him being put to death by his own brethren and killed, and what the punishment will be for them. And that I kind of tend to think somewhat that the cup and him being sorrowful about it really doesn't have a whole lot to do with himself. And wouldn't that be characteristic of our God and his Messiah? That he's not terribly concerned about himself.
Because everything he says while he's on the cross has nothing to do with himself.
Right.
And when he looks, even at John, says take care of, my mother. Everything that he says is,
right.
Most of us when we're sick, that's all, a sick person just really thinks of himself, my
Right.
pain, my agony.
Right.
But he didn't. He actually, like, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Everything that he said was,
And it would be rather unusual for him to fear death, because there are so many instances in the Bible and the Torah and the writings and the Psalms and the prophets which say, do not fear death. You're not allowed to fear death. So it would be unusual for him to just be saying, I'm terrified of dying and I'm afraid of what they're going to do to me. I don't think that that's what it is. I really don't. Gracie?
I think that just when he would say that he could have called 12 legions of angels, he could have. Any time from the day or the time in our minds,
Right.
that he left his home and glory with the Father and came to be born. Every moment of his life here on earth, he was aware of where he was headed, and he was aware of what it was going to accomplish for after the thought, after the fact.
Right.
And it just, sometimes I just, not for very long at a time because I can't handle it, sit and just ponder on what he left, what he set aside willingly, and at any point during the time he was on earth, he could have called it all off.
Yeah.
He still would have been gone.
Sure. And that's how Satan tried to tempt him in just about every way. He's like, why have you humbled yourself like this? This isn't unbecoming of you. You really should take back some power. And that's how he tempted him in a lot of ways. So, but he was unwilling. He was unselfish and willing to do what needed to be done for us.
Is the cup like the cup of judgment? That he says, let this cup pass for me?
Yeah, let this cup pass for me. That's an interesting question. Obviously he's using figurative language, but it kind of reminds me of the one of the cups in the Passover Seder for whatever reason. I mean, that's one of the things that I think of. But the cup is like it's obviously a metaphor, I think. But what do you think about what that metaphor is talking about? The cup. If it's possible, let this pass, but nevertheless, not what I want, but what you want. So it's almost like he's saying, I really don't want this, but it's not about what I want.
It's almost like he was saying, if we could do this without me having to physically die, let's go for it.
Yeah.
But I don't think there's any way that we can do it without me dying, so that's what you want, Dad, that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
And they made the agreement millions of years before.
Sure.
And God can't go against his own nature.
Yeah, it was all planned.
So
it was all planned. Yeah, it makes you wonder. What is he asking to have removed? And I just wonder about that, because I think, well, maybe it would be, bless you, it would be a little strange for him to say, I really don't want to die. So knowing that that's exactly what the plan was, I just have a feeling that it was something else. That it was.
I don't think it was just one thing. I think it was the whole situation, the whole ball.
Yeah.
Just the
Angela?
whole thing.
I'm not convinced he knew exactly what was going to happen.
You what?
I said I'm not convinced that he knew exactly what was going to happen. And that at this point, he might have been thinking of Isaac. And then he went up to the mountain and surely was going to die, but then didn't. Maybe he thought, I don't know.
Well, some people might call it blasphemy to say that Yeshua didn't know what was going to happen, that he wasn't omniscient. But I would say, you know what, it's certainly possible that he had enough humanity in him that, or had put aside enough of his glory that he wasn't omniscient. Certainly he knew things that he heard from his Father, and he was aware of things that his Father made him known to him, but maybe he wasn't all omniscient and knew everything that was going on. He seems to have had things revealed to him that were pertinent to the situation, but maybe God hadn't completely, filled him in on the whole, what this is going to be like. And I think your idea of him having in his mind, I'm going to be sacrificed, I'm going to sacrifice myself like Isaac was going to sacrifice himself for his father Abraham. I'm going to do it willingly and just let somebody, slice my throat, and it'll be over like that, and it'll, this is how it's going to work. But then when he began to realize, this is not what I had in mind, being tortured and beaten and mocked and spit on and laughed at and hung on a execution stake for a little while. That, who knows? That's Jerry.
On the Mount of Transfiguration, I think God gave him a pretty good idea of who he was and what he was all about. He had the 2 disciples with him. Or was it 3? 2, I think.
Yeah, 3. Yeah.
They wanted to build him a couple of sukkahs because they
Yeah.
didn't want to go. They wanted to hold the Feast of Tabernacles there instead of going back to Jerusalem.
Yeah, that
And,
seems like it.
But I think that he pretty much knew who he was and what it was all about.
Yeah, yeah.
Is he not God? Am I getting confused here, or?
Well, he is God, but it's a strange mix. I mean, he's got to be human and he's got to be God, and people have been banging their head against that wall for a long time trying to figure out exactly what that means, and I don't think we're going to solve it tonight. It's a deep, tremendously powerful mystery.
The Yeshua part, the man part, and then the Christus, or the Messiah that was in him, the God in the man.
That's a great mystery. You couldn't possibly misunderstand it any further than anyone else has. Keith, you're up next, buddy.
So, without debating what he knew or what he didn't know, but bottom line is he's our example. Okay.
Sure.
He, as a man, manifested as a man to be our example, and the recording of this scripture here definitely shows God's mind that as a man in that tense, he had fears, but at the same time, he prayed to the Father 3 times, and every time he said, "Your will, I will do your will."
He submitted himself.
And that's our example.
Right,
there.
right.
I will do your will. No matter what happens in this life,
Yeah.
fears, whatever, we go through and we do God's will.
Good point.
So-
Good point. Mike, and then Tracy.
I was just going to point out, whether he knew it was going to happen physically or spiritually. I think he was aware of what the scripture said as far as what was going to occur.
Yeah.
He points that out, quotes Psalms while he's.
Sure. Yeah. Right. Yeah, absolutely. Tracy?
That's what I was going to say. I think he was fully aware, because when he said Eli Eli lama sabachthani, he was saying, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Quoting, I think it's the 22nd or 23rd Psalm. So those who know the scriptures would go there and see that's all about me and what's happening right now. So I think it's prophetic.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, why do you think that Yeshua kind of chastises his disciples about falling asleep? I mean, frankly, we know that if they did have a Passover Seder, or they observed the Passover, that, they're staying up all night long. This is a long thing. They probably had several cups of wine. They're sleepy. They're falling asleep. It's like, this is a beautiful evening. They're going to sleep, and he's trying to get them to pay attention. Why is he chastising them about slumber, and what temptation do you think that he's warning them to be watchful of?
I think the flesh, he says it at the end. By the way, quick side note, in most translations, at least my regular translation, the third one, when he goes to them, he doesn't say, like yours says it correctly, go sleep. The third time he says, go rest, go sleep. But in most other Bibles it says actually, you're sleeping again, or some
Yeah,
towards
right.
it, which is kind of weird.
Interesting, yeah. So go ahead and sleep.
Yeah.
Yeah, but then it's like almost like he's talking to himself, and he says, "All right, get up. It's time." But he gives them a little while to sleep.
And by the way, it was also interesting what you said earlier about the 3 times and the oil, the best oil to pray that.
Right.
So maybe that indeed is the spiritual component from those 3 elements that I felt 3 times.
Yeah,
asleep.
sure. It's good insight. So what do you think that he's warning them about? What is he warning them about here? It's like, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Watch. What's he warning them about?
Don't give in to your fleshly desires and distractions.
Okay. This reminds me of the time in the Gospel of John in chapter 4 where he meets the Samaritan woman, and they're probably hungry from been traveling on the road, and the disciples go into the town of Sychar to get some food, and they come back and ask, what you do? Are you hungry? Eat. And he's like, I have food to eat that you're not aware of. My food is to do the will of him who sent me. And it's an example of saying, my flesh is not terribly important. I'm not going to die. We see him go apparently without food like Moses did for 40 days. I don't understand how that's possible. It's obviously miraculous. People in our day and age die, even fat ones, from being without food for 40 days. So that's got to be a miracle. Being able to not eat for 40 days that's something. And so, and I get the impression, like you said, that he's really talking about, I know that your flesh is telling you, look, we've had a little bit to drink. It's probably 2 o'clock in the morning or, midnight or something like that. We've been up all night. I'm just telling you, I know you're tired, but there are super powerful spiritual things afoot that you are completely not aware of, and you're slumbering. And so I think it's a lesson for us to really remember to put things in perspective regarding our fleshly needs and our fleshly desires versus the unseen world that we sometimes are completely oblivious to. Would you agree or disagree with that characterization? Gracie?
I also think that the reason it says, watch and pray that you don't enter into temptation, the spirit is eager, but the flesh weak. So I think part of it is that, like what the disciple did and cut the guy's ear off, his spirit was eager to defend the Lord, his teacher.
Right.
But when it comes right down to it, you get scared, and you get, and then he went and denied the Lord.
Right.
And just for examples of the eager spirit and the weak flesh, and the Lord knew they needed to be praying.
Yeah.
Because they didn't have the strength in themselves to go through the next however many days.
Right.
Until they would see him as their risen Lord.
Right. Absolutely. Prayer is such a powerful mystery. It's a powerful mystery. Because, it's interesting, and that might be a study to do one day. It's just really biblical prayer. What is biblical prayer? Because I know that the way we normally pray and the way that I was raised in church normally praying is almost never found in the Bible like that. It's kind of interesting. It's a very mysterious topic. And what is your relationship in prayer? That's a powerful thing, but I think we misunderstand it in a lot of cases. So
I think also same as meditation and prayer. If you do deep prayer or meditation, you almost fall asleep. You almost do what those guys do.
Yeah, that's true.
If they were praying.
Yeah, if they were praying.
Sleeping, but
yeah. I mean, I'm thinking about the, what words do we say? What are the words that you're supposed to say to God? I mean, a lot of people are like, well, you pour out your heart. What's in your heart, and that's one thing. And then of course, the Jews have mostly canned prayers with some pouring out of the heart. There's no question about that. But then you look at the biblical examples of prayer, and they're very, very different. Very different indeed.
Kind of like the Lord's Prayer.
Yeah.
That's an example of how Jesus taught the disciples to pray.
Right, and that's a canned prayer, And then this here is if there was ever a outpouring of what's inside of you, not canned, it's coming out. This is it. And what does he say? I am not happy about whatever's about to happen here, but nonetheless, it doesn't matter what I want. what you want is what's going to happen, and I'm going to be okay with that. That's a challenging prayer to pray, because we always pray about what we want. You know, we want people to be healed. We want people to be saved. We want people to be have their marriages reconciled, or relationships fixed, and get off drugs, or stop drinking alcohol, or quit smoking, or whatever it is. We're praying for God to help us in certain ways. So it's a challenging topic, and the Messiah gives us an example here. He's like, yeah, I've got desires of my own, but they really don't matter. What you want is what really matters.
Pouring your heart out to God and what He wants is a big difference.
It certainly is. Yeah,
And then
like
you do what
it
you have
can
to
be.
do.
To the point that we begin to align ourselves with God, then our will can become more aligned with His, and I think that's the ultimate objective. What's interesting? I heard someone talking about a quote from C.S. Lewis. And I know that many of you have read some C.S. Lewis. I think he's an amazingly insightful teacher. You've ever read that book, Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis? It's tremendous stuff. But in one of his writings, he described what it was like to align yourself with God's will, or align yourself with God, so to speak. He said, imagine that you're in a small room that has no windows, there's no cracks under the doors, there's no light anywhere. It is completely pitch black. And then all of a sudden, whether through a drill or whatever, a little hole appears in the ceiling, and a little tiny beam of light shines through this hole that's the size of your finger that somewhere popped into the ceiling. And you can still see nothing. It's dark, but it's just a beam of light. And you can see, little dust motes and particles in the beam of light, but it's not illuminating the room because it's just a tiny shaft of light. And he says, what you do is you lay down on the ground and you align your eye with that beam of light. And what happens when you do that is that all of the darkness disappears, and your whole eye is full of light, and all you can see is light, because you've aligned yourself with this little tiny beam of light which is shooting through the ceiling. And everything else falls away. All of the darkness is gone. Your whole body is full of light because you've just laid down and looked up with that beam of light shining right into your eyeball. And I think he uses that as an example of aligning yourself with God and His will. And I thought that's a powerful metaphorical picture of aligning yourself with the will of God, understanding what His will is. I think that's very, very interesting.
What's the name of that book again?
Mere Christianity. Now, does verse 52 teach us that we must not take up weapons to defend ourselves or others? He says, and you've heard this obviously many, many times, live by the sword, die by the sword. That's a very popular, common phrase that people use from this passage right here, that basically is the teaching, you are not to defend yourself, you are to die, turn the other cheek, this kind of thing. Is that what this is teaching? Is this teaching you to not take up the sword ever in defense of your life or in defense of others? What is it talking about then? Yeah, at the end of the other gospel, he tells them to buy a sword. So why is he telling them here that he who lives by the sword will die by the sword?
It's more defensive, I think, also. It's how you do it.
I think this particular situation is under His control, and if they try to take control, they're going to die.
Yes, I think that's exactly what it is. And I think it's pretty obvious from the context, but which a lot of people miss sometimes, and I'm not saying you would, but a lot of people do when they quote that. You need to realize he's talking about right now is not the time for your sword. And he tells them, don't you think that I could call 70,000 angels here to defend me against this group of people with swords and clubs? put away your swords because they will kill you. And that is not what we have in mind for you 12 disciples of mine. You've got work to do. And you don't, in this moment is not the time to take up your sword and fight these people. Because some of you might die or will die, and that is not part of the plan. Put away your sword. And you can see in the book of John that he then heals this. What's the name? Pop quiz question. What's the name of the servant?
Remember that 100 times.
Oh, come on. It's worth extra points. Don't look it up. Ani, I see you cheating over there. No one? It's Malchus. Malchus is the name of the servant who got his ear cut off. And then Peter cut off his ear, and then Yeshua had reattached it.
What's Malchus meaning?
I don't know. That's a good
I
question.
think we looked at that before, and there was some significance around
There probably is. I'm sure there is. What does Malchus remind you of? That Malchus, Malchut. What is Malchut? Do you know, anybody know what the Hebrew word Malchut is?
Messengers?
Huh?
Is it messengers? No, or king?
Is it kingdom? I think it's kingdom, isn't it? Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder if it's connected.
Means king and Malchut means kingdom.
I wonder if that's related somehow to Malchus. I don't know. It sounds like a Greekification of something, maybe. I'm not sure.
I should say, by the way, Peter, not in here, but in which is it in Mark that they reveal that knowledge?
It was actually in John.
John.
In John, it's revealed that Peter is the one who takes his sword and cuts off the guy's ear. And then it's also in John that he puts his ear back on.
Interesting that he doesn't mention it here in Matthew.
Yeah. Yeah, he probably feels bad for his brother Peter and doesn't want to, embarrass him in front of the whole world. But yeah, so that's not an injunction against taking up the sword because, in Mark also he says, now, once they're getting ready to kill me and he appears to them after his death, he says, now's the time to buy a sword. It's time to defend yourselves. If you have a cloak or an extra cloak or something, sell it and get a sword because they will try to kill you and I don't want you to die. We're going to protect you. You're going to die eventually, but we need you to live for a while because you've got a job ahead of you. So yeah, that's a good thing to remember. So all the disciples flee. This is the sheep scattering after the shepherd is smitten.
So Simon Peter is hearing the rock, right? And he cuts off the ear of the kingdom. And then the Messiah fixes the ear of the kingdom.
Interesting. Cuts off the ear of the kingdom. That's a curious metaphor, isn't it? Peter cuts off the ear of the kingdom. What a crafty piece of work that is. Isn't that awesome? Yeah. So the disciples all flee. And it makes me wonder if we could say, well, they all lost their faith and they fled. But is that necessarily true?
Oh, we got afraid.
Well, I don't even know necessarily that they got afraid. He seems to be saying, I don't want you to fight. Well, what's the other option? Flight. It's fight or flight. He doesn't want them to fight. So what's the other option? I think that he is implicitly telling them, run. Run. And he even tells, in the book of John, tells the people who have come for him, says, hey, you came for me, let these others go. Do you remember that? So I think it's very likely that he is letting them know, run. I don't think that they're being fearful necessarily. I'm sure they were afraid, but maybe that's not the reason.
I mean, it's interesting. He warns them several times to not sleep because of them, because he says you will fall into temptation if you don't stay in the spirit, in prayer. And I think what we see is they act very fleshly. Like Peter cutting off the ear is a fleshly act, and maybe them fleeing even, getting scared and all this.
Yeah.
I mean, it's understandable, but it's very fleshly.
Sure. Yeah. It certainly could be an act of flesh and just fleeing because they're afraid, and I'm willing to grant them that. I mean, Peter denies Yeshua 3 times here, coming right up, and they're definitely acting in the flesh. But I wanted to give them an out, potentially, give them a little benefit of the doubt that maybe it was okay to run because they would have otherwise been captured and killed along with him, and then the plan would have been disrupted. So I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt is all I'm saying. Jerry?
You got to remember at this point in time, the Spirit hadn't been given either.
Yeah.
So it's pretty hard to live by the Spirit if you don't have the Spirit.
Well, that's certainly true, and that's another hugely mysterious topic, because the Spirit did come upon people in the New Testament and in the Old Testament.
It was very selective.
It was very selective, so that's a big mystery right there. But yeah, you're right. I mean, the Spirit hadn't been poured out. What exactly is the role of the Spirit in comparison with the New and the Old Testaments? That's a tricky dick question right there for sure.
In itself.
I thought when they ran, run, Forrest, run.
Run, Forrest, run.
I have a crazy imagination, sorry, but
Yes,
I
you do.
enjoy my own laughter.
You're not the only one.
What do you think about how the Messiah addresses Judas when he comes back? Phrases.
Yeah, hey,
why-
friend, why have you come? Or yeah,
Kind of reminds me of the wedding feast parable about the
friend,
guy.
what are you doing here with that clothing on?
Yeah, we talked about that.
Yeah, we did.
We did that.
Yeah, I've got some questions about Judas coming up here, and I think that Judas is a little bit of a mysterious character, and we'll talk about that in a minute, because I'm not sure if it's what I have always assumed, and probably nothing is what I've always assumed, but we'll see. I'm going to move forward just a little bit to Matthew 26:57 through 75, and here in Matthew 26:57 through 75, we have this. Now, they that had seized Yeshua led him away to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were assembled. And Kepha followed him at a distance, even to the palace of the high priest, and entering in, sat with the officers to see the end. And the chief priests and the elders and the whole Sanhedrin sought false witnesses against Yeshua so that they might put him to death. And they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. But at the last 2 false witnesses came forward and he said that he was able to destroy the temple of Elohim and in 3 days build it. And the high priest, standing up, said to him, "You make no answer? What did these witness against you?" But Yeshua was silent. And the high priest answering said to him, "I adjure you by the living Elohim that you tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of Elohim." And Yeshua said to him, "You have spoken. Moreover, I say to you, from now forward you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothing, saying, "He has blasphemed. What need have we of any more witnesses? Behold, now you have heard the blasphemy. What think you?" And they, answering, said, "He is liable to the death penalty." Then they spit in his face and beat him, and some struck him with the palms of their hands, saying, "Prophesy to us, Messiah. Who is it who struck you?" But Peter sat outside in the palace court, and the maid came to him and saying, "And you were with Yeshua the Galilean?" But he denied it all before everyone, saying, "I do not know what you were saying." And when he had gone out into the entrance, another saw him and said to those there, "This one also was with Yeshua the Nazarene." And again he denied with an oath, "I do not know the man." And after a little, those who stood there, coming to him, said to Peter, "Truly you are too one of them, for also your speech makes you known." Then he began to curse and swear, "I know not the man." And immediately the cock crowed. And Peter remembered the words of Yeshua, who had said, "Before the cock crows, you will deny me thrice." And he went away and wept bitterly. There we have, I think it's interesting, and this is something that you might look at, make a note to yourself about Yeshua praying 3 times in the garden and Peter denying Yeshua 3 times, there potentially could be a chiasm there. Something to look at. Let me just ask you a couple of simple questions here. Who are the parties who are responsible for the arrest and the crucifixion of Yeshua? Judas got the ball rolling. And what happens then? Who's responsible for this?
Probably the Sadducees,
Sadducees?
maybe the Pharisees.
Well, what's interesting is that ever since just before chapter 24, the Pharisees don't appear again in this book at all.
Sanhedrin.
The Sanhedrin is made up of the chief elders and the scribes and the
Pharisees
Sadducees.
too, right?
So the Pharisees are gone from the story.
The devil.
Huh?
The devil.
The devil is certainly instigating it, absolutely. Now, what do you think can be learned by this? The fact that the Sadducees and the elders, the priests, and in their collaboration with the Roman government are the ones who killed Yeshua. We have no inclination anywhere that the Pharisees were in collusion with Rome at all. It's the chief priests and the scribes and the Sadducees who are involved in politics. The Pharisees are not in any way, shape, or form, as far as we can tell from the text. Now, what can you infer from that, or would you infer anything from that? It's just a question. I don't have a statement to make or a point to make in that regard, but I'm just pointing out here that the Pharisees are notably absent during the whole last section of this book. They really seem to have nothing to do with him being crucified and killed. It's the other party who does it. Keith, first?
Well, I don't think they had that kind of power to move in that direction. They could moan and gripe and do everything, and they always gave information back to the temple and the Sadducees about what they saw, but they didn't have the level of authority.
Right. And you also know that the Pharisees and the Sadducees hated each other, right? Mm-hmm. If you've read any of the Dead Sea Scrolls, you can see that there are polemics in those Dead Sea Scrolls where the Sadducees and the Pharisees wrote scathing, withering letters against each other, calling each other the spawn of Satan, and they were tearing each other up. They hated each other. Anya.
And isn't it that the Sadducees kind of disappeared? I mean, now modern day Judaism derived from Phariseeism.
Right.
So
they're gone from history as far as I know, unless you want to say the Karaites would be the next thing to a Sadducee. I mean, just from a biblical standpoint.
Was Nicodemus a Pharisee?
That's an excellent question. Does it indicate that he was? It says that he was. What?
It says he was a high priest.
Nicodemus? No, I don't think it says he was a high priest. Caiaphas and Annas are the high priests.
It does say he's a Pharisee, though.
Does it say he was a Pharisee?
Yeah, I can look it up.
Yeah, would you look that up? Nicodemus, I thought that Nicodemus, no, I'm thinking of Joseph of Arimathea. I apologize. So Joseph of Arimathea is a rich guy but Nicodemus is a Pharisee, right? Oh, yeah, he came to him by night.
Yeah.
In the Gospel of John, chapter 3. Yes, okay. So, Nicodemus is a Pharisee. Yeah.
So that's interesting because Nicodemus, I mean, he was curious about what Yeshua had to say. I think he believed, they believed in Yeshua.
Yeah, I agree.
And I wonder if that has anything to do with what.
That's interesting that you say that, because you can see in the end of the Gospel of John that it's Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, Nicodemus stands up for him, and I believe that he was part of the little crew that was with Joseph of Arimathea who took his body and prepared it for burial. And in the book of Acts, we see that the party of the Pharisees, some of them did become believers. And unfortunately, they caused some problems for these Gentiles who were coming in saying, hey, these Gentiles that are coming into the faith, they gotta be circumcised or they cannot be saved according to the custom of Moses. Now, that's a whole separate subject, but it does appear that It's obvious from people who have studied this, and I'm not a great scholar in this area, but a lot of scholars of this time period and the sayings of Yeshua and everything say that he is most often aligned with the Pharisees and very rarely aligned with the Sadducees, and that he is most often aligned with the house of Hillel against the house of Shammai, except for a couple of instances. But you can see here, like Jerry said, the Pharisees were not a ruling party. They were like country priests who had charge of the synagogues spread throughout the countryside. So they are in charge of the religious life of the suburban areas outside of Jerusalem. So yeah, they have some authority in the rural areas around Jerusalem, but Jerusalem and its immediate environs are ruled entirely by the Pharisees, or the Sadducees, and that's an entirely political thing, and they're in league with Rome and Pontius Pilate and Herod. So just to note here that it is the Sadducees and the priests and the scribes and the elders who are in charge and who are the ones who condemned Yeshua to death and saw to it that he was put to death. Now, I'm not saying that maybe the Pharisees didn't have it in their heart, some of them, to kill him. But you know what's interesting? Yeshua condemns the Pharisees quite a bit, doesn't he? For what most often? Not quite. What? Hypocrisy. That is correct. He beats the tar out of them mostly for hypocrisy. There are a couple of instances where he says, you have invented some stuff that goes against the commands. But most often he is coming against them for hypocrisy. So if he's coming against them for hypocrisy, then what does that tell you? What does that tell you their real problem is?
We're all asleep.
You're all asleep. No, that's okay. Angela?
They're saying one thing and doing another, so they might be saying the right thing and just not doing it.
Yes, and I would say that a Pharisee is the direct equivalent of a standard run-of-the-mill person who's born in America and says, I'm a Christian because I was born in a Christian nation and I went to church on Sunday once. And they tell everyone they meet, I'm a Christian, yeah. I believe in God. And they might even go around telling people that they're Christian. Doesn't make you a Christian.
It's interesting too, because Nicodemus, being this Pharisee, he's the one that the Messiah describes being born again to.
He has no idea what he's talking about. Yeah, that's kind of interesting.
Being born from above, being born again.
Yeah.
He's the man that he described that to.
It's like, can a man crawl into his mother's belly and be born a second time? What are you talking about? Angela, what were you saying?
I don't know. I thought that the Pharisees seemed religious, not just like, oh, we're in Jerusalem, so we're in with God. They seem more to me like a person who goes to church and says all the right things and does the right things maybe one day, and then, you know what I mean?
More religious than just somebody who's
Yeah,
born in America and
it's
says,
almost like you were
yeah.
comparing them to people that are kind of flippant and uneducated about things. The Pharisees were educated.
Yeah, that I would agree with that because they seem intensely religious, but they don't follow their own religion in a sense. I guess is what that would be marking them as a hypocrite for sure.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. Is like telling people this is what you need to do, but they're not doing what they need to be doing.
Right.
But I was just gonna say that I don't think we can really put that umbrella over all of the Pharisees and all that they were all
Yeah,
'cause I
clearly
think Paul
we-
even calls himself a Pharisee. Doesn't say
Sure.
I was a Pharisee. He says I am a Pharisee.
Right. So yeah, we can see Nicodemus, and I think Robert's correct. I think Nicodemus was a believer, although a secret one. In fact, I think the Gospel of John actually says exactly those words. He came to him by night, and then at the end of the book, it does say that he was a believer, but a secret one. So there's there were some Pharisees who were believers in Yeshua for sure, but.
You remind me of ISIS. They're borderline ISIS. They're killing people, stoning people, judging them for their own thinking that they believe in Yahweh, but they actually do everything opposite of what he tells us to do.
Well, the problem is that they believe the right things, they just don't do them.
And never do they believe the right thing.
He challenged them on their beliefs only a couple of times. It wasn't their beliefs that were the problem. It was their actions that were the problem. They spoke with their mouths the right things, but they didn't do what they said. He says, they're laying these heavy burdens out, but they themselves are unwilling to lift them with even a little finger. And so he doesn't come against them a lot for their teaching. There are some instances where he says, you have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God for your own traditions. So they do incorporate some traditions that are not a part of the instructions of God. But most often he's beating the tar out of them because there's nothing wrong necessarily with their instructions, but that they don't even do it themselves. They're all talk. So I think that's the main issue with those guys. And you know what happens when somebody talks too much? You're likely to get yourself into trouble. And that's why James says, let not many of you become teachers, because you incur stricter judgment. Someone over here wanted to say something. What was it? Was that you, Keith?
Yeah, I was just going to say it was more, their hearts.
Yeah.
Call them the whitewashed tombs and all that. What was inside? Clean up the inside before, because you polish the outside, but then the inside's filthy.
Right.
And they killed him.
Yeah. What's that?
And they killed him as well.
Who did?
Well, they killed Yeshua.
Who?
Well, like the Pharisees and.
That's what I was point I'm making.
Yeah.
They did not kill him. They were not involved. Sadducees, not Pharisees.
Okay.
So that's. I'm just making a distinction here.
Sure.
Well, from the text, as much as we can from the text.
That's how they were like ISIS. They believed the wrong thing and did the wrong thing.
Yeah, now ISIS believes the wrong thing and does the wrong thing. I mean, the Pharisees might have believed the right thing but did the wrong thing, but ISIS is a whole different thing. Yeah, that's but interesting characterization.
The Pharisees believed, thought that Christ knew that he was, in their frame of thinking, an interloper into their fiefdom. And they wanted to get rid of him before he upended that fiefdom. Yeah, I would agree. Interestingly, if you look at the way that the Pharisees interact with Yeshua, you'll often see them asking him questions, trying to trip him up sometimes, and sometimes sincerely approaching him looking for wisdom. Like, they can recognize that he is a great teacher and are saying to him, what is the great commandment? Because they're always looking for the greatest commandment. And what is this? I'm missing some wisdom, some insight. What can you tell me? How can I inherit Chai Olam? Well, I do all those things, but what am I still lacking? It seems like in a lot of instances, the Pharisees are addressing Yeshua with a sense of curiosity, and they certainly get angry at him, and he gets to button heads with them. But you notice when the greatest trouble occurs for Yeshua, and when he actually, in the book of John several times, is like they seek to stone him and kill him, it's not the Pharisees, it's the Sadducees, and it's because it only happens when he's in Jerusalem. And you notice when the book of John also, he's like, I'm going back to Jerusalem. Lazarus is dead, and we're headed back that way. And they're like, I guess we better go with him and die. The Jews over there were just seeking to kill you, and are you going back? You notice that, and kind of look at that as you're doing your studies. You'll see that his interactions with the Pharisees is mostly dialogue, questioning, challenging. He's challenging them and questioning them. They're challenging him and questioning him. But it's when he goes to Jerusalem and gets involved with the Sadducees and the chief priests and the elders that things get dangerous, and that they try to stone him, and that they're trying to capture him, but he eludes their grasp. You see, it's that type of language that is used when he goes to Jerusalem, because that's the center of the political world. That's where Rome and the chief priests and elders are meeting, and they're ruling this place. That's where the trouble happens, and that's where the trouble is happening. And I'm not under any circumstances trying to absolve the Pharisees and saying that they're okay, but you know what? Some of them were, and many of them got saved. And he didn't have as quite a contentious relationship with the Pharisees as he did with the Sadducees and the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Those are two very different categories. And I just wanted you to keep that in mind and note as we continue to read, and also look at it in your own reading, that the Pharisees don't really seem to have anything to do with his death. They had seemingly no part in it. There were some there, but the only ones that we see there at the end are the ones who come forward to bury him secretly.
Is it the same as the scribes also? You're saying they don't have much to do with it, they're more in the background as well?
Yeah, the scribes and the elders and the chief priests would be this political ruling class that's in Jerusalem. And the Pharisees are synagogue leaders, mostly, and itinerant traveling ministers. It's a very different group of people. So I just want to make you aware of that and begin to consider how he interacts with these people. There's probably 100 books written on Yeshua and the Pharisees and Yeshua and the Sadducees, and I can tell you they're very different, and they interact in a very different way. So, yes, sir.
Can I say one more thing before
Please.
you leave that? Just real quick, it says the Pharisees believe in the resurrection.
Yeah.
And they believe in the spirits and
Right.
Where the
Sadducees did not. Right.
I wonder if that made them wonder if Yeshua would really be resurrected. Maybe.
If you'll remember at the end of the book of Acts, when Paul was about to be arrested, or had been arrested and had actually placed himself into the custody of that Roman proconsul, and then was in Jerusalem, and those guys had taken an oath that they were going to not live out the day unless they killed Paul. And when Paul saw that half of the people that were there were Pharisees and half of them were Sadducees, he was very clever. He turned them against each other.
Yeah.
He said, "My brothers, I'm a Pharisee, and I have been a Pharisee my whole life, and I believe in the resurrection, and it is because I believe in the resurrection that I am on trial before you today." And then they began to fight with one another, and a riot started breaking out, and he took off. So he was pitting the Pharisees against the Sadducees for his own benefit, and I thought it was hilarious. But yeah, that's a good insight, Robert. I think that they're very, very different groups. And you're right, Ani, the Sadducees seems to have disappeared from history. They were, I think it makes sense because they were the priests in control of the temple, and when the Romans destroyed the temple, you got no need for these people. And now the Cohens are the ones who sing, like Robert Cohen, and make nuclear bombs, Who knows? Anyway, why do you think that the text says that the Sanhedrin could not find false witnesses, although many arose? Did you think that's a kind of a curious statement that they called forth many false witnesses, but they found none, though many false witnesses came forward? What does that mean? What is that implying? Keith?
Well, they called people as witnesses, but then when they gave their testimony, it turned out they were telling the truth. They said, "Well, we don't want that one. We don't want that." That
Yeah.
It didn't fit what the Sadducees were looking for.
Didn't fit the evidence
If
pattern
you
they were
speak
looking
what
for.
they wanted
Yeah.
to hear, they just put you aside.
Yeah, I've heard two different takes on this, and one is that they were looking for witnesses, and the witnesses who came forward, some of them were telling the truth and were of no use to us as Sadducees trying to kill this guy, and the others were downright liars, and their testimony could not be corroborated, could not be proven true, and so they could not be established as a true witness.
Well, they're trying to keep Torah, so the testimony has to be, a truth has to be established in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. Perhaps
Yeah.
they could not find 2 or 3 false witnesses saying the same thing.
Right, absolutely. And remember in the Torah, what about the person who comes forward to give false witness?
If he's proven a liar, he dies. Or he takes the punishment of the...
That's right. What
the person
he
that is
wanted to
trying to
have
condemn.
happen to the person he was testifying against happens to him.
Do you know where that's at?
That is in Deuteronomy chapter 27, I think.
He not only dies, but everything that he owns and has goes to the guy he lied about.
Absolutely. So bearing false witness is some serious business.
They didn't have jails back then.
No, they did not. They would only hold you. Now, they did have jails in a sense, but not because you're serving out a sentence. You're being held for court, and it happens rather quickly. I mean, you see that the disciples were captured and thrown into prison overnight, and then the next day we're going to be taken to, get the court
In the
going.
Roman things they had.
Sure, yeah. God does not
But
put,
not in the Jewish.
yeah, our God does not have any way set up for jails. He has no use for jails, which is a very interesting commentary.
It's Deuteronomy 19, I think starts at 15, goes to the end.
Okay. That's about the false witness and what will happen.
Deuteronomy
Yeah.
19, 15 to
Okay.
21.
Excellent. Excellent. So they were probably trying to suborn some perjury here, and we have problems with our witnesses. And bless you, Robert, but they come forward finally, and they did find some witnesses. Now, are these false witnesses?
No,
The
he
ones
did
who
say
finally
that.
come forward?
He did say that.
Did he say that?
No.
Did he say?
No, he did not.
Twist.
No,
Not
he said
quite.
something similar to that.
He said something similar to that. What did he say?
He said, destroy this temple and I will raise it up. He didn't say, I will.
That's right. He said, destroy this temple. He did not say, I am able to destroy the temple of God. He did not say that. So they took his words and twisted them a little bit. So, yes, ma'am.
And also in his John, when he says that, they didn't know what he's talking about, but then they realized later he's talking about the temple of his body.
Right.
He didn't destroy the temple of his body, they did.
That's right.
So destroy this temple and I will raise it up.
Yeah, he says, you destroy this temple and I will raise it up. Absolutely. Absolutely. So, yeah, we got all kinds of problems. And I know that if you haven't, you should do a little bit of research about just how illegal this trial was. There are a whole slew of ways in which this trial of Yeshua violates the Torah and violates the rules that they themselves had established. Some of them are clear violations of the Torah itself, and others are violations of the rules of the Sanhedrin, like you can't hold a trial at night, certain things like that. That's not in the Torah necessarily, but it is part of their own rules that they set up. So, and you've got to have where's the trial supposed to be held?
City gates or something like that.
In the city gates, which we already know where that is because we were talking about that a few weeks back. That is in Bethpage, which is just outside of Jerusalem, which they would have turned the gates of the city for that time and place. So where did they hold this trial?
Temple court.
In the house of Caiaphas.
It couldn't have been at the house of Caiaphas. He was in the temple.
Well, it says that they led him away to Caiaphas the high priest, and they went to the palace of the high priest, and this is where they're looking for their witnesses.
That's not right, because the high priest went to the temple a week before every feast, and that's where he stayed for a solid week. He wasn't in his house. He stayed there preparing himself for the feast.
Okay, so perhaps, well, no, that can't be right, because it says that they followed him. Kepha followed at a distance and went even to the palace of the high priest, and entering in sat with the officers to see what would happen. And Caiaphas is the high priest who is actually
But
questioning
he's not going to
him.
have the whole Sanhedrin at his house. They're going to be at the temple. All these people that are trying him are at the temple, at the Temple Mount, preparing for the Passover. This is the night before the Passover, before the sacrificial feast the next day. The high priest is preparing himself to kill that Passover lamb. He's not in his house.
Somebody is.
No, but it's not him.
It's not him? Okay.
Maybe his wife.
You could be right. There could be some mystery.
Well, we've done a lot of study on this. What's his
Rico? Yeah.
Rico's got a huge study on it.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. Well, you know what? You could be right.
And it's like the high priest, when he ripped his garment, he disqualified himself to be high
Now,
priest.
I have heard that before from Matthew Nolan,
And,
but there was nothing in the Torah that I was able to find that suggested that a high priest could not rip his robes.
And this is why they always had a secondary or another one standing in the background to jump in and take his place if he disqualified himself.
You know, and that is an interpretation that people have made because of when Nadab and Abihu got burned by fire for offering strange fire on the altar, and Aaron was about to tear his clothing, and Moses said, "Do not do it." He stopped him and said, "The time for mourning your sons is later. We are in the consecration process right now, and you've got work to do, so don't do that right now." So some people have said, well, and the Pharisees and the scribes have also interpreted that in some cases in the Talmud that I have heard about and not read myself, that a high priest was not supposed to rip his robes, that's the way they interpreted that passage. That could be true, it could not be true, I don't know. But some people, including Christopher Nolan, I think his name is, or Matthew Nolan, have gone around saying that when this high priest ripped his clothing, that he immediately disqualified himself as high priest, and the high priestship then transferred immediately to Yeshua of the order of Melchizedek. And that, you know what, that is a interesting theory, and I wouldn't discount it. I'm just saying some people believe that, some don't. I don't know. Somehow that priestly office was transferred to the Messiah after the order of Melchizedek and was taken away from the sons of Aaron. So how exactly that happened, it could have been that. I don't know. It's possible. This is a plausible theory. Any ideas on that, Tracy?
No, it's on something else.
Oh, please.
I'll wait till you put it. Close it up. I just want to say something I thought.
Oh, okay. All right. So why is Yeshua charged with blasphemy? Is it blasphemy to say I am the Messiah?
He claimed he was God.
Is that what they? Is that well? Look at what he says. Now, of course, he made no answer when they charged him and said, "You said." He said that he was going to destroy the temple and in 3 days he could raise it up. But he didn't even respond to that charge. Okay, but then the high priest says, "I adjure you by the living God." So now he puts him under oath. He calls him out in the name of God, "You must speak." And so he does. And he says, "I adjure you by the living God that you tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of Elohim." And then Yeshua says to him, "You said it." But then, I got something else that I would like to add to that. I am telling you that from now forward you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. That is blasphemy. What is blasphemous about this? Did he say to them, "I am the Son of God"? Have we read anywhere in this story of Matthew that he said to anyone, "I am the Son of God"? No. He never once has said, "I am the Son of God." Now, we know that he did in other Gospels, but in the Gospel of Matthew, and that's what we're dealing with here, he did not ever say, "I am the Son of God." He said, several people asked him, "Are you the Messiah?" And he said, "You've said it. Yes, I am the Messiah." Now, the priest seems to drop that in there himself. "Are you the Son of God?" Now, is that blasphemy to say you were the Son of God? Now, I know that many people say, well, yeah, if you, especially in the Gospel of John, where he definitely more strongly comes out and says, I am the Son of God, but why are you tripped up about that? The Torah says you are gods, right? I called you gods, and all of us are sons of God. So I'm just asking you, why are they freaking out here? What's the blasphemy?
Maybe because God was not a triune God, he was a singular God, and here's Christ coming along saying, "I am equal with the Father," or
by saying I am God's Son,
or I am
making
God's
himself
Son,
equal.
or whatever, and God and I are one, or whatever.
Okay.
Something of that nature.
Okay. You could, yeah, and I think it's entirely valid to take some of the things that Yeshua said, maybe in the Gospel of John or Luke or something, and apply them here. No, and I totally understand. And you know what? They happened. I believe he said those things, and so it's just maybe it's not recorded in Matthew, but we can still apply them because they're in the Gospel of John. Tracy, and then Keith.
He says, Messiah says, "You said it, I tell you more. From this time you shall see the Son of Man sitting off the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of the heavens." And these guys know Scripture.
Sure they do.
Daniel 7.
Exactly.
It's a vision, and he says, "I was looking in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man." came with the clouds of the heavens, and he came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him, and dominion was given to him, and glory and a kingdom, and that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. So that's why it's blasphemy in their eyes.
But see, that's a little strange to me because the prophet Daniel says it, and he's saying that's me.
And they're
so
like, what?
Why is that blasphemy?
Because they don't believe it. You're a man. You cannot be.
Yeah, that's a curious thing. Keith?
Well, now with your translation, of course, when the high priest says, you know, are you the Son of God? And by Yeshua not acknowledging, mine says he actually said, yes, I am. Okay, my translation says Yeshua says, yes, I am.
Right.
Okay, but most translations said you said it.
You said it.
Just
You
you
know,
said.
but just by him saying, just you said, is he acknowledging that? Is that an acknowledgement?
Yeah.
So
That my
translation
understanding
by
is
saying,
that
yes, I am, is the
my
same
understanding is that is a Hebrewism to mean yes. You said it. It is true. Yes. So that's he says it like 4 times in this gospel alone. When somebody gives him a direct question and the answer is the affirmative, he says, "You have said it." Yeah. In fact, he says it to Judas. When Judas says, "Is it I?" You said it. So it's interesting. There's a curious thing there about, and in fact, that's one of my questions here. Note that Yeshua responds to the high priest and Judas with using the same words. You said it. I just thought that was kind of curious.
Well, he also said earlier, Matthew, about by the words of your mouth I will judge you. So I'm wondering if that has anything to do with
That's an interesting, it's an interesting take on that. Like maybe you have spoken it, I'm confirming it, and now you're going to be judged by what you said. It sounds like something God would do.
Before we move on, I just want to throw out that I thought was interesting when they twisted his words here, saying that he said, I'm able to destroy.
Right.
Think about how Satan spoke in the garden. He says, even if God said you shouldn't eat of every tree, he didn't say every tree.
Right.
He said just that one tree.
Right.
That's what they just did.
Yeah.
A little twist of it.
Yeah.
But that's why we need to know God's word, because if we don't, that little twist
Right.
sounds good.
That's all it takes
It
is a
sounds
little
true.
twist.
It's good and evil right there.
Yep.
And you have to be able to discern the two.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, you can get anything you want from this Bible. It'll support you any way you want as long as you twist it just right. And people do all the time. Just give it a little tweak and you can get whatever you want out of this thing. Yes, sir. Yes.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if there, like we were discussing, so what was the blasphemy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe it's not that he said something against Torah, but they did not think he was the Messiah. And they knew that would be the Messiah to speak like that. So now Yeshua spoke like that and they didn't accept him as the Messiah. And I also think, I mean, he came against their system. And they were creating their system. They were in the power, you know, they were teaching people certain things and he came against that. So they would have, I mean, by recognizing him as the Messiah, they would have had to really kind of repent, and they knew, wow, this is it for us. I mean, for that system, you know. So. And
you can see that Pontius Pilate himself identifies the reason why they just tried to kill Yeshua is because of envy, jealousy. They're jealous of him. They know he's the Messiah. They know he has power and authority, and they don't want to give it up. I think Pilate spells it out pretty accurately. That's why he washes his hands of the situation and says, I'll have nothing to do with this guy. You guys take him and crucify him, because he knew they had given him up for envy. So that's an excellent point. Excellent point. So, you know, Tracy pointed out a moment ago regarding this passage from Daniel chapter 7. You know, what's interesting about that Daniel chapter 7 is I don't believe, Tracy, and you know, maybe you can correct me, but Daniel 7, what does it say specifically regarding something being at the right hand? Does it reference the Messiah being
the right hand is power, and And I
But
think
does Daniel actually say that?
he says all power and dominion are given. Let me read it again.
But it doesn't say anything
Oh.
specifically about him being seated at the right hand, right?
I think it's just no, it doesn't. I think it's just and I'm sure we can find some other scriptures that talk about
That's
the
what
right
I
and the
was,
authority.
yeah.
And
Well,
I think that-
I'm thinking in my mind, is there another prophet somewhere who said something about somebody seated at the right hand?
David, Solomon.
Okay.
Lord said to my
Yes,
Lord,
sit at
to
my
my
right
right-
hand
yes,
until I make
yes.
your enemies a footstool for your feet. Okay,
Which ties
so
into
he's
that.
quoting two passages. Is that chapter 22 of the Psalms, or is that Psalm 2? I think it might be Psalm number 2.
Psalm 110,
Is it 1?
110.
Psalm 110 where he says, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet? Okay. So Yeshua is actually quoting two separate prophets here in one statement, saying, I am telling you the truth, from now on, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power. That's one. And then coming on the clouds of heaven is two. Coming on the clouds of heaven is from Daniel chapter 7, and seated at the right hand of power is from Psalm 110. What's the difference there? From now on and from now forward, what do you notice something curious about that phrase? From now forward, you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power. In what way, shape, or form is that even possible? What is he talking about there, Mike? Sorry.
Well, it goes on in Daniel to say that dominion is given to him, glory and a kingdom. All peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion. So it's talking about him being the king, the coming king.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's what you're asking.
Well, no, I think that you can definitely imply from Daniel chapter 7 that there's right hand authority involved in that passage. But I think that he's talking about something specific here, seated at the right hand of power. And I think you're right about him quoting from Psalm 110. But I'm wondering why. Why is he making a distinction? Because one is from now forward, you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand, and then coming in the cloud. When does he come in the clouds of heaven?
Revelation 19.
That's at the end. But what about when is he sitting at the right hand of power?
Oh,
Because
right
in the
now,
Psalms
as a high
right
priest.
now,
As
because
a
in the
high
Psalm
priest.
110 it says, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. Here is where he's making the enemies a footstool for his feet when he comes on the clouds of heaven with great power. But here he's seated at the right hand. And so he has been seated at the right hand of the Father for almost 2,000 years. And then he comes on the clouds of heaven. Do you think that they...
The day of the Lord.
Right, that's the day of the Lord right there. So do you think that they understood what he was saying there? I think they did. And I think that's what they're calling blasphemy.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
They know these scriptures. They know way more than we do.
They certainly do, yeah, absolutely. But I just thought that was interesting that he was quoting from two different books and that there's something going on there that's a little different. And it bears probably digging a little bit deeper to figure out a little bit more. What is there to say about the denial of Yeshua by Peter? Not much, but you could definitely look at the end of the Gospel of John, where he appears to him, and comes to him 3 times and asks him, shepherd my sheep, shepherd my sheep, shepherd my sheep, once for each time that he denied him. So there's some interesting things there. I think we need to wrap up. We're getting a little bit long in the tooth here. But next time we're going to Matthew chapter 27. So we've got Matthew 27 and 28 left. Again, does anybody have anything that they'd like to throw out for the good of the order, for the good of the fellowship of the ring? All right, let us pray.